Ken Myers has an extensive background in various forms of journalism. He is a former National Public Radio producer and editor. For a while, he edited Eternity magazine, so he has also been in print media. Since 1992, he's been working with an organization that he founded, Mars Hill Audio. He's the founder, the president, and the executive producer of the Mars Hill Audio Journal. If you don't know the Mars Hill Audio Journal, all I can say is shame, shame, shame on you. It is far and away the best Christian cultural commentary that you will get anywhere in our day. It's a bi-monthly audio magazine in kind of an NPR format. Ken has an NPR voice, you know the voice that everyone that works for NPR has, he still has it. And he talks about Christian things and does interviews with artists, with historians, with sociologists. You can't find anything better than Mars Hill Audio. If you don't get it, again, shame, shame on you. This weekend he's talking about something that's very near to his heart. A recent Weekly Standard profile back in mid-January had this to say. Andrew Ferguson writes, Myers has big plans for the next few years with a particular attention to music. He's planning a series of podcasts on the standard classical repertoire, one piece per podcast, and another on sacred choral music, which he's pursuing with a special ardor. Quote, I hear interviews with the singers and conductors who perform these works, and so many of them say they don't really believe what they're singing, Myers says. Meanwhile, the people who do believe it don't know anything about it. He has a wounded look, Andrew Ferguson says. I expect we'll see some of that wounded look this week. It's just a horrible, horrible thing, Myers adds. Not just wounded looks, not just the horrors of our current musical situation, but Ken has plans to do something about musical education in the churches and in American culture more generally, and he's going to tell us what it means to learn music and what kind of effect it has on our lives as Christians. Ears to hear the possibilities of musical meaning. Please welcome Ken Myers.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's a privilege to be here. I was in Moscow, I think, 4 or 5 years ago, and admire much of the work and many of the people who are part of the work here. It's a little bit daunting. I'm a great admirer of Peter. I think I've interviewed him twice already, so and I'm a great admirer of his work, and I thought, well, what can I say that he hasn't already told them? So I hope there's something here new. These were really hard lectures for me to complete. I've been doing lecturing for the last couple of years, whenever I can, lecturing about music and the state of music in our culture and the nature of musical meaning theologically. And this series in particular, which was building on work I've done in the past. I know there's some lectures that I gave a couple years ago which are available online, and I didn't want to repeat material that I'd already made in public domain. That's a problem with the internet. You get this stuff out and then people hear it and then they want to hear something new. It was hard because I'm addressing a topic that's not discussed in much detail, and I'm taking a really unpopular position, and I don't like taking unpopular positions. I do not have the temperament of a prophet. I wanted to be a disc jockey. I wanted to play tunes. I wanted to play tunes that people wanted to hear. But it turns out that the tunes that I think need to be heard aren't being heard, both literally and figuratively. And I don't like being prophetic. I have some friends who love being prophetic, and sometimes they probably say things they shouldn't, but I also realize I can only scratch the surface of a very complicated subject that would take really a long time and a lot of one-on-one connection to really get across. And as I've done lectures on this subject in other settings, I've stressed the idea that what I want to do is just light a fuse to launch both personal study but also conversation and community about these issues. Another reason it was hard is that my thinking on these matters is not entirely settled. That is, it's not entirely defined. I know a big outline, but there are a lot of pieces that I'm still working to fit in myself. And I realize that I have so much to learn. The other reason they were hard to write is, as I was working on them, I kept wanting to stop and listen to some music. And I kept thinking, well, gee, why don't I just play a lot of music for people? Maybe they'll just absorb what has to happen. Because that's the best way to learn about how music means, is to actually listen to music. Now, we will listen to a little bit of music tomorrow, and we'll also look at some poetry about music, which I think might be helpful. Tonight I will read from some stories about music, which will set the stage for my discussion of a number of issues. First, let me give you a preview about where we're going. I was working on these things until virtually the last minute, and so didn't get an outline in time. And I tend not to, I'm not real outline friendly, it turns out, and I was trying to figure out why is that? Is it just because I'm so disorganized? And I began to think that the most charitable explanation is that I began to think that I do approach my lectures more like writing a piece of music. And if you tried to outline a symphony or a cantata, you probably wouldn't get a really good picture of it. A cantata that follows, or a symphony that follows an outline, probably isn't a very good symphony, would be another way of putting it. And so that's the charitable explanation. There's probably a much better explanation that's not quite as charitable. Where are we going? We're going to look at some theological issues, biblical issues, as well as some cultural history, both very recent cultural history and some older things. There'll be a little bit of music theory. I have a very odd vocation. I interview people who are specialists in all sorts of areas. And I'm a generalist, and I run the risks and enjoy the advantages of being a generalist. I get to plunder resources from a wide range of disciplines. But I always realize that specialists in these fields could do a more thorough job than I can in treating the issues. So I'm always a little nervous that the people I'm interviewing, when I write the script to summarize what their books are about, that they might think I missed the point. So it's kind of daunting. And I'm always commending the work of various specialists, as I will during these lectures. I'll recommend some books. Someone told me I had the gift of bibliography. It's not on any of the canonical lists, but I think I try to practice it regularly anyway. Tonight, I've given titles to each of the 4 lectures, if you want to jot these down to help figure out what I'm supposed to be doing at this time anyway. And I've come up with three words, 3 nouns for each of the 3 lectures. Tonight, creation, order, and wisdom are the 3 ideas that I want to riff on. And I'll try to sketch out why I think the question of how we think about music, and more importantly, what our musical practices are, why they deserve much greater critical attention from the church than they're receiving. And in introducing the subject, I'll try to raise some questions about an angle of approach to cultivating better thinking about music and culture. Explain why there's a link between the method that I'm trying to advance and the actual substance of our thinking about music. That is, that the idea of order and wisdom dictate both a method, but also there's something about the nature of music which is about order and wisdom also. Tomorrow morning, the first talk, Culture, Nature, and History, and I'll offer a quick survey about how music has been understood in the West, some of the high points and low points of our understanding of the nature of music, both in the pre-Christian classical thought and in the theologians of the early church. I'll look at some early modern ideas about music, and try to put thinking about music in a broader context of how Western culture has understood the order of creation. The third lecture, Form, Meaning, and Listening, which will be a rather brisk and merciless attack on the idea that we can neatly separate form and content. On this matter, that myth is one of the things that deserves again, a merciless approach. Most people finally don't believe that, and you only need about 15 or 20 minutes with people before they realize that, no, they do believe that form actually is meaningful. And so we're going to look at some examples tomorrow of how form is meaningful in general, but also how musical form conveys meaning. And then the 4th lecture, Tradition, Community, and Discipleship, where we'll look at some recent trends in American society that have caused an indifference to significant aspects of musical meaning, and I'll talk about the idea of sustaining a musical legacy, and how sustaining a musical legacy is really a fulfillment of what music is and does and what a community is and does. And my main points throughout the talks can be summarized briefly, and these are not things I'll treat in sequence. These are the motifs that I'll be revisiting throughout the talks. Music is a wonderful gift from God that presents unequaled opportunities for delight, for sharpening our perception of reality, for enabling unique communication between people, and for conveying to us something of the beauty of God and His creation. The second point, modern culture's typical treatment of music eclipses its greatest possibilities. And third, the church's countercultural identity should render it into a people with a distinctive musical life. These 3 points, as I said, won't be treated in sequence. There will be claims that will surface through the discussion like melodies in a cantata or symphony. So let me start with a personal story with 2 chapters. Chapter 1, about 10 years ago. I'm walking into a Best Buy store with my son of 14 or 15 years old. And we're not more than 20 feet into the store when he stops. And I look behind me, he's got a pained look on his face. And he says, "Why does it have to be so loud?" If you've been in a Best Buy store or a store that sells stereo equipment or televisions, you probably haven't even noticed how loud it is. And I was struck, first of all, that I didn't know how loud it was. I had not noticed. I'd kind of tuned out the ambient noise in this place. And then I was struck that a 14-year-old perceived it and I didn't. I was proud of our homeschooling, actually, at that point. I thought, well, it's produced something. It's a remarkable question for a 14-year-old to ask. Why does it have to be so loud? He may have been the first 14-year-old in history to ask this. There should be a plaque in that Best Buy store. And it's a good question. Fast forward, chapter 2. About 8 years later, I'm walking in the same Best Buy store. And I'm by myself. And I'm walking through the part of the store where they sell headphones and earbuds, right next to the MP3 player section of the store. And I overheard a recorded message on a little kiosk. That recorded message, it was emanating from a display, warning about the dangers of hearing loss because you listen to music too loudly. And the voice was explaining, I walked by just as it was explaining how easy it was to suffer severe hearing loss by not wearing ear protection at the average rock concert. Why does that be so loud? My son's question of years later came back, and I began to think, what can we say about a society in which its typical musical habits eliminate the possibility of ever hearing music again for some people? Isn't there something wrong here? It's like food that kills your taste buds. Or, I don't know, sexual practices that render you impotent. Why would you do such a thing if the very possibility for the activity is eliminated through the practice? What does music mean in such a society? Is it possible that modern American culture is at least as confused about music as it is about other things? And this is a question I've been raising for the last couple of years in many circles. Because there are many other things about which our society is confused. And most of us know this. Some of us have a short list, some of us have a long list of things about which our society is confused. The work that I do requires me to keep a really long list. I interview people, writers, scholars in one discipline or another, sometimes pastors, sometimes artists, each of whom has thought long and hard about some specific aspect of contemporary culture. And many of them have diagnosed some way in which something in our culture has gone wrong, some imbalance or confusion or toxicity, some set of practices or institutions or conventional governing assumptions in our life. And often, these people offer a theologically informed analysis of why the typical cultural practices or the ideas in this particular area fail to do justice to the kinds of creatures that we are and the kind of world that we live in. They fall short of the calling that believers have in particular to honor God's ways in God's world. And as I say, it's a long list, the list of topics that my guests, I refrain from going online and looking through the long list of topics that we have on our website. But I just off the top of my head as I was jotting these down, education, the nature and meaning of education, which is something this community is committed to, the nature and practice of community, what the meaning of food is and how we live with it, how technology invites a misshapen understanding of human power and choice, how urban planning works to hurt communities. The list of confusions about sexuality would be itself a long list. I've done an interview on churches' funeral practices and how they differ from historically what the church has done and how they actually fail to help us understand what the death of someone in our community means. I've done interviews on the confusion about language. I've done interviews about our confusion about a sense of time and place. Even the nature of reason itself is misunderstood in modern culture. I did an interview with James Peters, who wrote a wonderful book, I think it was called The Heart's Reasons, which was on Augustine and Pascal's understanding of reason and how reason is not just a kind of objective mechanism that helps us evaluate truth claims, but reason is actually given to us by God to help us love the truth, not just to know it. The idea of knowing it abstractly and not loving it was not on the radar in pre-modern Christianity. So there's this long list of aspects of human culture, aspects of human experience in which the dynamics of modernity, the dynamics of living in a secularized culture, a culture that wants to exclude God from defining reality. In all of these areas, there is a confusion, and in many instances, the church has been captive to the confusion. And there are, thankfully, from my point of view, for the work that I do, there are lots of books written on this, so I get to interview the authors and practice my gift of bibliography and let people know, here are these wonderful books. And I'm impressed. I started thinking about these sorts of things when I was in college, partly under the influence of Francis Schaeffer. And there weren't a lot of books on these subjects in 1970, 71, 72 when I started thinking about these things. And now there are bookshelves, whole bookshelves full. You could conduct a virtual library, some of them better than others, but people are asking these questions, and I'm very grateful for that. Ways in which modern culture has misrepresented or misguided us, ways in which we might say various idolatries have distorted our own beliefs and practices. And I attend conferences sponsored by Christian organizations often, either churches or parachurch groups, in which a number of people gather to talk about these things. And again, a long list of subjects comes up. If you follow this world of church and culture, one of the weird things about it, if you go to those conferences, you could easily come to the conclusion that the only area of cultural life that has been immune from any distortion is our musical life. In these settings, one can find serious discussions about how we ought to regard genetically modified foods or whether cremation is a faithful practice. There are conversations about how the Enlightenment view of reason has distorted the practice of theology and the conduct of education. There are discussions about how modernist urban planners have disrupted communities, why churches should look seriously at the challenges offered by new urbanism. But if one tries to raise questions, as I have, about our musical culture, how can I put it? No thoughtful discussion ensues. I'm usually regarded as Grandpa Simpson, at these moments, if I dare. And this is really amazing. This fact is an amazing fact. It either means that we have, in fact, that our musical lives have, in fact, been immune from all of the totalizing distortions that modernity has wrought in our culture. And somehow this one area of our life is so pure that it has withstood all of the temptations and confusions. It's either that, or we are so culturally captive. In fact, we're not just suffering from cultural captivity, we're suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, whereby, what Stockholm Syndrome is, where somebody who's being held captive actually starts to love their captors and defends them. Music is not a marginal activity either in society or a marginal activity within creation. Music is, after all, one of two central cultural activities, including the eating of meals, that are part of our eternal joy. We'll be singing and eating, we know that for sure, forever. So how is it, given the fact that modernity has really misshapen and mangled our perception and practice of food, as a number of my interviewees have argued, Leon Cass, Norman Wiersbe most recently, and a number of other people have made this argument. How is it that music has escaped? I don't think it has escaped. I think that our refusal to talk about this subject, the way we treat technology and farming and language and reason, is a symptom of the fact that we are more captive in this particular way to the kind of cultural confusion that typifies modernity. It's a very strong claim, and it's one that's very hard to make in public. It might be a little easier to make it here than in many other places. But it's still a very strong claim and a hard one to make. It's interesting to me also that for 30 or 40 years there has been some debate about music among Christians, but it's almost always been focused on the question of music in worship. And if I do introduce the question of music in those settings, people immediately think I'm talking about music in worship. And many times I've had to say, no, let's just let's set worship aside for a minute. Let's talk about our musical lives from Monday through Saturday. And then they really think I'm crazy. Because the idea that we would actually challenge what we do Monday through Saturday with regard to music, they're willing to at least defend their position with regard to music in worship. But the idea that music in everyday life would be something open to criticism, or open to at least examination, critical examination, in light of all the other things we know about modernity. Again, it's just implausible to people. And I get these blank stares. There have been a few thoughtful books that could help in this. Jeremy Begbie's book, Resounding Truth, which is subtitled Christian Wisdom in the World of Music, has some very helpful discussions in it. Begbie is a theologian and an accomplished musician, and he points out early in the book that, quote, many of us rarely, if ever, stop to think about what music is, how it works, what it might be doing to us, and what we might be doing to it. But Begbie's book is not as prophetic toward the cultural status quo as many of other books on other subjects written by his colleagues are, although I think he's a little more critical in private than he is in public. Given how much music there is in our lives, given the billions of dollars spent on music, the unprecedented presence of music in every setting, given how musical culture transformed Apple computers, it's remarkable how little serious discussion there is in the culture at large about matters that are distinctively musical. There's a lot of talk about the music business and about technology and music and delivery systems of music. But there's not a lot of discussion about things like melody, harmony, and rhythm, things that actually define what music is. There's a lot of talk about musicians and their careers, who has a new song coming out, what trends are coming, what trends are going. For a while there was a lot of talk about Lady Gaga's hats. But there's not a lot of public discussion about the distinctively musical part of music. I recently received a book from a Christian publisher, very respected Christian publisher have published books whose authors, many of whose authors I've interviewed, called Personal Jesus: How Popular Music Shapes Our Souls. And I have to confess, the book came and I was afraid to even open it because I had a near fatal heart attack 15 months ago. My cardiologist recommends that I avoid stress. But I just assumed it was going to be bad, and I hate to feel this way. And seriously, it sat on my desk for 3 or 4 days before I could even open it. The publisher's summary on the cover says that the book explores the theological significance of the ways pop music is listened to and used today. Popular music is used by religious and non-religious people alike to make meaning, hold that idea, to make meaning, enabling us to explore human concerns about embodiment, create communities, and tap into transcendence. So I finally started leafing through the book, and I was a little surprised, first of all, that it was as technical as it was, but not technical with regard to music. It was more technical with regard to a lot of sociological categories. And from a very, very cursory examination of the book, and I don't want to diss the book without reading it, but the authors do seem to assume that the pride of place that popular music has in our lives, and in our institutional lives, the presence that it has in everything from Super Bowl halftime shows to background music you hear at restaurants, as well as in people's personal lives. It wasn't something to be challenged or examined critically in any way. It was a given. It was a given. It would be like, living in Kansas and challenging flat terrain, and lobbying for more ascending and descending topography here. You just don't do that. Deal with it. How can we make the best of a flat terrain? So how can we make the best of what sociologists would call the hegemony of popular music? It's a given. It's not going to change. It's not problematic in any way. We're just going to deal with it. So I looked in the index. A couple days later, I picked it up later. See, I don't like controversy. I really don't like controversy. I picked the book up and I look in the index for 3 little words. Those 3 little words: melody, harmony, and rhythm. They don't appear in the index. So here we have a book about music that doesn't talk about the most essential aspects of music. There's no evaluation, there's no musical evaluation of popular music in this book, apparently. It, as I said, sociological, interested in describing how people use popular music, and always how they use it in good ways, not how they use it in bad ways, but here are all the constructive things they can do with it to build community and to define identity. And I thought it's a bit like writing a book on how people might use casual sex or junk food to make meaning for their lives, and without evaluating the mechanisms that they're using to make meaning. People do that, but it would be foolish to write a book that ignored the substance of the thing, and then to ignore the kinds of meaning that are available given those resources. So apparently there was no interest in evaluating popular music as music. Now, one of the few books that does approach the question of music as music, and which does raise serious questions about the typical assumptions about music in our culture, is a book that's not about contemporary life, but a book about the ancient church and music, Calvin Stapert. I'll have a slide with the bibliographic information tomorrow. The book is called A New Song for an Old World: Musical Thought in the Early Church. Calvin Stapert has taught music for many years at Calvin College. No relation. I don't think. In the introductory chapter, it's clear Stapert he went back and read Gregory of Nyssa and Clement of Alexandria and Augustine and lots of patristic sources to figure out what were they saying about music as they lived in a disordered culture, the disordered culture we know as the Greco-Roman world. But it's clear that what Stapert wants to do is to get us to learn from the posture that they took in their world and ask, how can we acquire wisdom from them? Or do we, again, as he says later in the book, people assume there's no wisdom to be gotten from these guys because they were so critical of the musical status quo in their world. But he writes in the introductory chapter, our thinking about music is truncated and twisted because we are the unwitting heirs of musical thought that has its roots in secular, naturalistic Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment thought, which was usually indifferent to and often hostile to Christian thought. And Stapert acknowledges that this is not unique to music. This is a condition that obtains with our thinking about almost all the arts, for instance, and literature. Christian thought on arts and literature have been very much influenced by ideas from the 19th century, from the century after the Enlightenment, from 19th century Romanticism. And numerous Christians have written books about that problem, that Romanticism presents a one-sided, distorted picture of creativity and art. And there are lots of books on literature that address that. And Christian literary scholars who've been trying to correct that misalignment. But the situation is much worse with regard to music. As Stapert notes, first of all, pre-Enlightenment literature, both Christian and non-Christian alike, has far more currency than does pre-Enlightenment music. He writes, we have never seen a time when Homer, Sophocles, Virgil, Augustine, Dante, Chaucer, and Milton were not read. And literary theory, though it has found much to disagree with in Aristotle, Horace, and Sidney, for example, has at least recognized their existence. There is no parallel situation in music. Although the last few decades have seen an enormous growth of interest in what's called early music, that is music before Haydn, let's say, maybe music before Bach, its impact on the overall music scene is still relatively small, and I would say its impact among Christians is almost non-existent. And Stapert goes on, more to the point, pre-Enlightenment musical thought has all but vanished. That is, how music was understood has all but vanished. Some music students are still required to read a few bits of pre-Enlightenment musical thought, but even for most music students, let alone the general populace, the musical ideas of Plato or St. Augustine, of John Calvin or Andreas Werkmeister are largely unknown. Furthermore, the little that is known is considered nothing more than an outdated, irrelevant curiosity. By the way, I'll mention a couple of other books. Cal Stapert has at least 2 books on Bach, including a biography and a book on Handel's Messiah, and he has a forthcoming volume on Haydn, I think. And tomorrow, I want to look a little bit more at that pre-Enlightenment thought that Stapert alluded to and the change that has been wrought by the Enlightenment. So that Stapert is one scholar who has raised this question. I mentioned Jeremy Begbie. Begbie notes early in his book, Resounding Truth or Resounding Truth. He puts a nice little pun in the title. He says, we've moved from a cosmocentric to anthropocentric view of music. And that is a wonderful way of summarizing what the Enlightenment did. I mean, it's a wonderful way of summarizing what the Enlightenment did in many other spheres also. We've moved from a cosmocentric to an anthropocentric view of music. That is, we now regard music as an expression of subjective inner realities rather than a representation of and in some way participation in cosmic realities. And if that's the point I'll be making over and over and over this weekend, if you get nothing else out of these talks, I hope you at least remember that claim, that we regard music today as an expression of subjective inner realities rather than, as was assumed to be the case for most of Western history, and we'll survey some of that tomorrow morning, rather than a representation of and participation in cosmic realities. The problem with the modern view of music and with the musical practices of most contemporary people is that they reflect the general problem with modern culture, which denies any order in reality established by God and asserts that we human beings are the sovereign makers of all meaning. Remember the blurb on that book that said how people use popular music to make meaning. In modernity, there is no meaning to be received that's inherent in the structure of reality or given by revelation or evident in the tradition of the church. There's no meaning there. We are the makers of meaning. And I'll, again, talk more about this modern myth tomorrow morning. I do want to call attention to the word I've used a couple times already, a word order. And it's in the title for this lecture. And it may be one of the most important words in these talks. Several years ago, I gave a commencement address at Westminster Seminary in California. And after my talk, in a casual conversation with an old friend, he said, "You use a word a lot that we never hear or never use around here. It's the word order." And I thought, well, maybe you don't use it. And I thought, well, I know I certainly do. Last year, I had a similar conversation with a teacher who's listened to a lot of the editions of our audio journal. And he said, you know, there's a word you use regularly. It's a word you use all the time. He'd had a little bit of bourbon. We were celebrating at the end of a conference. And we were drinking what we were told was Walker Percy's favorite bourbon. And I was afraid he'd had a little too much because there's a word you use all the time. And I'm thinking, what word is that? He says, you use the word givenness. Givenness. Every time I listen to you, I just wait for you to say givenness. You're exactly right. He said, oh, thank you. I thought. Givenness. And I do use it. I wasn't aware of the fact that I use this. Now I'm self-conscious about it. I do regularly use the word givenness. It's a concept that has shaped my thinking about what's wrong with contemporary culture, that we don't recognize the givenness of creation, that there's a goodness and givenness about creation. Order and givenness, I think, are essential ideas in how and what we should think, in both how and what we should think about creation and culture. Now, my friend was right. In Reform circles, there's generally more talk about law than about order. And living faithfully is typically described in terms of obedience to God's commands. Now, what I want to do is to try to expand our frame of reference and argue that God's commandments are not arbitrary rules that he imposes as a sheer act of will, not that anyone here would believe that, but rather God's law is an expression of an order that he has created. That divine law articulates specific obligations embedded in that order. But that the order may have ramifications that aren't explicitly described by specific biblical commandments. I know I picked up some of my interest in order from reading Oliver O'Donovan, who has a wonderful book on ethics called Resurrection and Moral Order. And in there's a wonderful summary. Donovan is hard to quote in short snatches because almost every sentence is explaining another sentence, which is explaining another sentence. But he has a wonderful, this almost fits on a bumper sticker. Well, if you had a really big truck, maybe. Man's life on earth is important to God, semicolon. He has given it its order, semicolon. It matters that it should conform to the order he has given it. That is, it matters that our life, how we shape our lives, conforms to the order that God has put in creation. Now, I want to suggest that when we think about our conforming to the order that God has put in creation, that we think about that conformity not just in terms of our obedience to law, but we think about that conformity in terms of wisdom. I mean, it would be, in fact, possible for someone, and I think our Lord actually condemned people for doing this, to be meticulous in their observance of the requirements of the law without actually perceiving the loveliness and the beauty of the order that the law reflects. The way the scriptures describe and commend wisdom to us, it seems that wisdom is more than just clever application of commandments. That wisdom involves an attentiveness to the givenness of creation that is outlined in the commandments without assuming that the outline is the whole of reality. Most of the wisdom literature comes in the form of poetry. And poetry is a form that requires attentiveness. The principal mechanism that enables the work of poetry is metaphor, the likening of one thing to another. And Solomon was wise because he attended to how things in one sphere of experience are like things in another sphere of experience. The Psalms regularly represent, in poetic form, the shape of the order that's present in creation. God's commandments are like fine gold or like honey. And we're expected to understand what's implied in that, and expected not just by having an analysis of it, but having some sense of the taste of honey, what it tasted like, an experiential sense. The righteous man is like a tree planted by springs of water, and if you've never seen a tree that's received lots and lots of moisture, it may be hard. I mean, you could get a botanist to explain all this to you, but it's the perception of the reality and experience that helps us perceive that order. And I happen to believe that when God created trees and created the capillary action that brings nourishment to leaves, that he has this reality in mind, that it's not just the psalmist doesn't just go and look for something, some convenient object lesson, but in fact, God has given us trees so that we will be wise about righteousness. It's an embedded audiovisual aid right outside the door. The wicked are like chaff which the winds drive away. Wisdom itself is described as a tree of life. Wicked speech is regarded as crooked. How could speech be crooked? Well, again, there's a metaphor there that we perceive a likeness between something that is crooked and what false testimony does. Jesus is a door, and he's lamb, and he's bread. So the spirit of wisdom is the spirit of poetic recognition. The spirit of wisdom is the spirit of poetic recognition, whereby the order of creation is recognized by acknowledging the likenesses of one thing to another. So the wise man doesn't need an explicit commandment for every situation or an algorithm for applying each of the commandments, because the wise man perceives the givenness that's there and, if I may use a musical metaphor, seeks to live in harmony with the givenness. And in fact, I think that we'll see tomorrow, the way music works and communicates its meaning metaphorically also. So there is something about my preoccupation with order as a kind of methodological category for describing our culture. I talk often about cultural disorder. It turns out that order is an important idea in Scripture. It's not just a method for describing something, but also order, as I'll say tomorrow, when you perceive a sound as music rather than just noise, you perceive the sound as music because you perceive it as existing within some order. So order is essential to the very existence of music. Now, I just said the wise man seeks to live in harmony with the givenness of the order of creation. Is harmony just a metaphor that we borrow from music? Or is harmony, like that tree, something that God had in his mind in creating us, in creating a world of sound, in creating the unique category of how hearing works, and how what we'll look at as the overtone series or harmonic series works in creating a sense of dissonance or consonance. Does music represent the great transcendent reality of harmony that's present in creation because it's present in the loving relationship of the Trinity? Is there a harmony in the relationship of the Trinity that spills out into creation and then is caught up in the making of song and sonata and symphony? In other words, is harmony an attribute of God, a cosmic reality made perceptible in music? And if so, does some music do that better than other music? Here's a footnote. I thought of this as we were driving over here, that when I use the word music, I don't have each and every instance of music in mind when I describe what music can be or is, any more than, and I thought, what analogy? Well, if you were talked about what a wonderful thing theology is, and what theology does for the church, you wouldn't mean every effort at doing theology does this for the church. Some theology is bad theology. So when I talk about music, I'm talking about it in a sense, in a kind of ideal way. I don't mean that music that every instance of music does this. Most instances of music do it to some extent. And some things we call music really aren't music, I would argue. Is harmony a reality given in the nature of God and hence in the structure of creation, and some music reflects harmony than others? Now, I want you to hold on to that thought. It is a theme for which there will be many variations in these talks. I want to look at one biblical text. I'd hoped to look at 3 or 4 tonight, and I realized I wouldn't have time to do that. I want to look at Job 38. Beginning at verse 4, and this is God's response to Job and his friends, God's answering of Job. And we're early in that. And God begins asking these rhetorical questions. In verse 4, where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? If I can paraphrase, when I established an order in creation. Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together and all the heavenly beings shouted for joy. It's a remarkable instance of music. And tomorrow we'll look at some poetry that was inspired by this text. The idea that the morning stars sing, and that, well, I assume heavenly beings refers to the angels, are shouting for joy. And I think Pope Benedict recently said that even though in the Gospel of Luke, when the angels appear to the shepherds, Luke says that they said, glory to God on the highest. But he says, of course, they didn't say it. They sang it because angelic speech is always song. So their shouting is musical. Angelic speech has angelic shouting. It's not just like the guys on the football team coming out of the huddle. There's probably some rich harmony and counterpoint involved in this. Now, is this simply a poetic way of saying that the creation of the earth was a really neat thing and we should be happy about it? Or does this text suggest that there is some kind of cosmic music that precedes human creativity, that there's a givenness, there's an order in which human music participates? Does music pre-exist our making in some way? Now, the experience that most modern people have with music, that sort of transcendent experience, is unimaginable for many, but not for all. I'm going to read a little bit from C.S. Lewis's Magician's Nephew, in which he alludes to this as well as to some pagan ideas about creation. But Lewis continues a long tradition in Christian literature when he includes an account of creation that involved music. Let me read a couple of paragraphs from Magician's Nephew. In the darkness, something was happening at last. A voice had begun to sing. It was very far away, and Diggory found it hard to decide from what direction it was coming. Sometimes it seemed to come from all directions at once. Sometimes he almost thought it was coming out of the earth beneath him. Its lower notes were deep enough to be the voice of the earth herself. There were no words, there was hardly even a tune, but it was, beyond comparison, the most beautiful noise he'd ever heard. It was so beautiful he could hardly bear it. The horse seemed to like it too. He gave the sort of whinny a horse would give if, after years of being a cab horse, it found itself back in the old field where it had played as a foal, and saw someone whom it remembered and loved coming across the field to bring it a lump of sugar. "God," said the cabbie, "ain't it lovely?" Then 2 wonders happened at the same moment. One was that the voice was suddenly joined by other voices, more voices than you could possibly count. They were in harmony with it, but far higher up on the scale, cold, tingling, silvery voices. The second wonder was that the blackness overhead all at once was blazing with stars. They didn't come out gently, one by one, as they do on a summer evening. One moment there had been nothing but darkness. Next moment, 1,000 points of light leaped out. Single stars, constellations, and planets, brighter and bigger than any in our world. There were no clouds. The new stars and the new voices began at exactly the same time. If you had seen and heard it, let me say that again. The new stars and the new voices began exactly the same time. I think this is the morning stars singing together here. If you had seen and heard it, as Diggory did, you would have felt quite certain that it was the stars themselves who were singing, and that it was the first voice, and Lewis capitalizes the word voice here, the deep one which had made them appear and made them sing. "Glory be," said the cabbie. "I'd have been a better man all my life if I'd known there were things like this." The voice on the earth was now louder and more triumphant, but the voices in the sky, after singing loudly with it for the time, began to get fainter, and now something else was happening, and I'll stop there. Now I want to call attention to that remarkable sense of conviction through the power of celestial music that this cabbie felt. It's a London cabbie. He perceives glory and is driven to adoration and to repentance. "I'd have been a better man all my life if I'd known there were things like this." What a remarkable thing to say. Now, we tend to think that the only road to repentance is through a verbal articulation of duties, but the cabbie perceives the glory of the order out of which those duties emerge. Like the disciples on the Mount of Transfiguration, he perceives glory, this time in an order perceived as music. And the glory drives him to a sense of his own sinfulness, expressed in a kind of colloquial British cabbie way. Now, before looking at a parallel passage in Tolkien in the Silmarillion, I want to read from the work of an agnostic or atheist who entertains a similar idea about music, which is quite interesting. The late Douglas Adams, some of you probably saw the movie Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you were really fortunate, you actually heard the radio plays on which the books were based, on which the movie was based. They started as radio plays, and they're really wonderful. You can get copies of them. Douglas Adams wrote some other books, including a sort of detective story called Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, which came out in 1987, a book that had the sequel with the delightfully English title, The Long Dark Tea Time of the Soul. And like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and if you've read his books, you know he's a serious skeptic. Not entirely cynical about traditional belief, but he's a serious skeptic. And the first Dirk Gently book is like Hitchhiker's. It's about many things. It's about time travel. It's about Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It's about extraterrestrial visitations. It's about mathematics. It's about the origins of life on Earth and the cosmic meaning of music, among other things. And it's a whodunit along the way. And there's a remarkable passage in the book in which one of the main characters, named Richard Macduff, has an experience of a cosmically ordering music. And I'm not giving too much away to say that the music later in the book is linked with Johann Sebastian Bach. And here's the experience with music that Macduff has. The air was full of music, so full it seemed there was room for nothing else, and each particle of air seemed to have its own music, so that as Richard moved his head, he heard a new and different music, though the new and different music fitted quite perfectly with the music that lay beside it in the air. The modulations from one to another were perfectly accomplished, astonishing leaps to distant keys made effortlessly in the mere shifting of the head. New themes, new strands of melody, all perfectly and astoundingly proportioned, constantly involved themselves into the continuing web. Huge, slow waves of movement, faster dances that thrilled through them, tiny scintillating scampers that danced on the dances, long tangled tunes whose ends were so like their beginnings that they twisted around upon themselves, turned inside out, upside down, and then rushed off again on the back of yet another dancing melody in a distant part of the ship. He's on a spaceship, by the way. The visions that were woven in his mind by the million thrilling threads of music as they were pulled through it were increasing increasingly a welter of chaos, but the more the chaos burgeoned, the more it fitted with the other chaos, and the next greater chaos, until all became a vast exploding ball of harmony, expanding in his mind faster than any mind could deal with. And then it was all much simpler. A simple tune that danced through his mind, and all his attention rested upon it. It was a tune that seethed through the magical flood, shaped it, formed it, lived through it hugely, lived through it minutely, was its very essence. It bounced and trilled along, at first a little tripping tune, then it slowed, then it danced again, but with more difficulty, seemed to founder in eddies of doubt and confusion, and then suddenly revealed that the eddies were just the first ripples of a huge new wave of energy surging up joyfully from beneath. Richard began very, very slowly to faint. And then later, Richard reflects on what he's heard. Such music, he said. I'm not religious, but if I were, I would say it was like a glimpse into the mind of God. Perhaps it was, and I ought to be religious. Now, I encounter that attitude not infrequently among people who are agnostic or atheist, who wish, because of the perception of glory in a work of art. And I find Bach seems to cause this more than almost anything, that they wish it were true, that the glory that's present there is just so wondrous and mysterious that they really wish that the cosmic vision that was theologically shaped in Bach's own understanding and the work he did to the glory of God that all that was true, that there was a creator, a loving creator who made a beautiful creation. Now, I want to underline the fact that in this description, it was melody and harmony and the interaction of melody and harmony that caused Richard to entertain this possibility. Melody and harmony, not a driving if uninteresting rhythm, which characterizes a lot of music that most people listen to, nor the authenticity of the performer, which characterizes the attraction of a lot of music people listen to. There didn't seem to be a performer, actually. The music was there was no performer. Nor the sheer volume of the music. It wasn't overwhelming just because it was loud, okay? It was melody and harmony, the two musical elements that are increasingly lacking in the musical experience of most people. And I'll talk about this and present scientific evidence to prove that this is actually the case tomorrow, since science is the way we know reality. Now, for those of you who've read J.R.R. Tolkien's The Silmarillion, you'll know that it begins with a creation account that is essentially musical. And I'm going to read just a little part of it now and encourage you to read all of it soon. There was Eru, the one who in Arda is called Iluvatar, and he made first the Ainur, the holy ones, that were the offspring of his thought, and they were with him before aught else was made. And he spoke to them, propounding to them themes of music, and they sang before him. That's what angels do, right? And he was glad. But for a long while they sang only one each alone. They sang only each alone, or but few together, while the rest hearkened, for each comprehended only that part of the mind of Iluvatar from which he came. And in the understanding of their brethren they grew but slowly. Yet ever as they listened, they came to deeper understanding and increased in unison and harmony. And it came to pass that Iluvatar called together all the Ainur and declared to them a mighty theme, unfolding to them things greater and more wonderful than he had yet revealed. And the glory of its beginning and the splendor of its end amazed the Ainur, so that they bowed before Iluvatar and were silent. Then Iluvatar said to them, of the theme that I have declared to you, I will now that ye make in harmony together a great music. And since I have kindled you with the flame imperishable, ye shall show forth your powers in adorning this theme, each with his own thoughts and devices, if he will. But I will sit and hearken and be glad that through you great beauty has been wakened into song. Then the voices of the Ainur, like unto harps and lutes and pipes and trumpets and viols and organs, began to fashion the theme of Iluvatar to a great music, and a sound arose of endless interchanging melodies woven in harmony that passed beyond hearing into the depths and into the heights, and the places of the dwelling of Iluvatar were filled to overflowing. And the music and the echo of the music went out into the void, and it was not void. Never since have the Ainur made any music like to this music, though it has been said that a greater still shall be made before Iluvatar by the choirs of the Ainur and the children of Iluvatar after the end of days. Then the themes of Iluvatar shall be played aright and take being in the moment of their utterance, for all shall then understand fully his intent in their part. And each shall know the comprehension of each, and Iluvatar shall give to their thoughts the secret fire, being well pleased. After this, the plot thickens. Again, melody and harmony are the defining and generative features of this music. It was celestial polyphony, not hip-hop. It was the interaction between melody and harmony. I want to close, and tomorrow, if this sounds awfully implausible to you, this claim about kind of celestial music, come tomorrow and we'll look at it a little bit more, both from some church theologians, early church theologians, and some more contemporary writers. I want to close with a poem by James Montgomery, and I have been able to find out if James Montgomery Boyce was named after him. I don't know if you know, there's a hymn writer named James Montgomery, lived in England 1771 to 1854. He was the son of a Moravian minister. And if you know anything about Moravian culture, you know that they're serious musicians, a great musical tradition in Moravian church. So that means he grew up in a church community in which music was richly enjoyed. Montgomery wrote over 200 hymns. Many of them were psalm paraphrases. His best-known works are probably Angels from the Realms of Glory, which I assume most of you know. A hymn we'll be singing soon in our church, Go to Dark Gethsemane. Some of you may know that. A hymn, Hail to the Lord's Anointed, one of my favorites of his. And in my own congregation, we recently sang one of Montgomery's hymns written in 1820 that I don't know if we had ever sung before, called Songs of Praise the Angels Sang. Anybody know this? Songs of Praise the Angels Sang. Okay, well, I get to introduce, I not only have the gift of bibliography, I have the gift of, what is this, tunography, no, I don't know what that would be called. It's a hymn that alludes to the text of Job, but it also alludes to the glorious promise of our joining for eternity into a heavenly chorus. By the way, I was reading a book on musical aesthetics in preparation for these talks, and the author, who's not a Christian, remarked in passing how hard it was to explain the advent of melody in human culture and the way melody can be so meaningful, and hence the way music can be so meaningful. It's hard to explain that from within a purely evolutionary psychology. What sort of survival value would melody have in human experience? And this is perplexing to the evolutionary psychologist. I think he's probably right. You couldn't explain it just in terms of a survival value. Melody, I think, is rooted in the structure of a creation by a creator and a creation that will be gloriously transformed. Now, we may chuckle at these poor Darwinians trying to explain music on their terms. And yet, I think many Christians still treat music as if it were materialistic, utilitarian, and as Jeremy Begbie notes, an anthropocentric thing. Because I think some of us think that if you can't prove through a scientific method that one musical work is more valuable than another, then unless we have an explicit biblical text to prove it, then it's just purely subjective. Now, again, one of my goals this weekend is to introduce or to reinforce the conviction that music shouldn't be regarded as a purely subjective reality. It's not something that we can explain through evolutionary means. And the place of music in the history of creation and redemption, as outlined by James Montgomery, gives us a vision for a much more cosmocentric. And by cosmocentric, we really mean Christocentric, since Paul tells us in Colossians that creation finds its coherence in Christ. As I'll say tomorrow, Christ, who is the logos of creation, the ordering principle of creation, and the logos that is love. So I will not sing all 6 stanzas of this, but I will read all 6 stanzas of James Montgomery's poem, because there's a story that he tells about music. He begins, "Songs of praise the angels sang, heaven with alleluias rang, when Jehovah's work begun, when he spake and it was done." So here we have angels singing at the moment of creation. Second verse, "Songs of praise awoke the morn, when the Prince of Peace was born. Songs of praise arose," nice verb, when he captive led captivity. So again, there's songs of praise in the birth and in the resurrection of Jesus. Third verse, "Heaven and earth must pass away. Songs of praise shall crown that day. God will make new heavens, new earth. Songs of praise shall hail their birth." Fourth verse. That's why you have to sing all 6 verses. And here's this wonderful rhetorical question, and I don't know of any, well, maybe, and can it be that I should gain, but that's a biblical allusion. "And can man alone be dumb till that glorious kingdom come?" Angels are singing all the time. Do we have to sit silently and just listen? No! The church delights to raise psalms and hymns and songs of praise. Saints below, with heart and voice, still in songs of praise rejoice, learning here by faith and love songs of praise to sing above. Born upon their latest breath, songs of praise shall conquer death. Then amidst eternal joy, songs of praise their powers employ. James Montgomery, you can find the text for that, and it's set in there are various tune settings of it, written in 1820. Are we to have Q&A tonight, or are we going to wait till tomorrow for that? Wait till tomorrow. Thank you for your patience. Sorry to run a little late here tonight, and I hope you all can come back tomorrow, and this has mostly been introductory, but wanted to lay out the groundwork of where we're going tomorrow in the 3 presentations. Thank you very much.